Good afternoon, everyone. I believe we're now live on this combination of Facebook and Zoom technology. We're going to cross our fingers and hope that we get through this without technical difficulty. But thanks for joining me for my weekly office hours. We've had to bump this around to some different dates and times recently, and that's because Congress has begun to resume hearings, and I am fresh out of a 48-hour markup hearing in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I can tell you a little more about that in a moment, but we normally have done this on Wednesday afternoon. Thanks so much for your patience and flexibility. And TGIF, here we are on Friday afternoon. And happy Juneteenth, everyone. This is a really important day. It's a day, of course, when we celebrate freeing the slaves, and certainly not a mission accomplished moment, but a huge marker of progress for our country. I think that's really what it's all about. And I will just tell you by way of catching up on things I've been doing the last few days, and then we'll jump into our office hours. I was able to do an online town hall with my friend Karen Bass, who's a member of Congress from Los Angeles who chairs the Congressional Black Caucus. And we had a deep dive on systemic racism and police reform and all sorts of important issues, joined by a couple of my constituents who are African Americans here in the 2nd District, very thoughtful local voices. And if you didn't join us live, you can actually go to this Facebook page. We'll have a link for it, and you can see that dialogue in its entirety. I think it's worth watching, and I'm really pleased with the way that all unfolded. Also this week, the Natural Resources Committee had a hearing on one of my bills that I'm really cautiously optimistic about passing in this Congress. It's my Public Lands Telecom bill. We passed it out of the Natural Resource Committee with bipartisan support in the last Congress. We're going to do that again in the weeks ahead. And what this does is it takes advantage of the synergy between our federal public land managers, who are often in these remote places. Think about my North Coast district, and think about U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service and BLM, and the communities around them, the Native American tribes around them, sometimes the other federal agencies around them also are starved for quality broadband service. So what this does is it creates the authorities and provides some resources for everybody to work together on partnerships that will provide really good broadband connection to these rural, underserved areas and Indian reservations in many cases. And it's going to be just a great win-win way to better deploy broadband connectivity to some underserved rural areas all over the country. I'm very excited about that bill. I mentioned that the last 48 hours was a long markup. A markup is basically when we take a big piece of legislation and we have a committee hearing where we entertain amendments and then take a final vote. This was a huge one because it's on one of the biggest bills that the Congress considers every couple of years, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. And I'm really pleased that this year we're putting forward the greenest and most progressive surface transportation bill Congress has probably ever seen. We had a lot of robust debate over the last 48 hours, and we were able to hang on to a lot of these really important climate and clean transportation efforts that we put into that bill. And that will now go to the floor of the House in the weeks ahead, and it'll be a big part of the big infrastructure package that you're going to see coming together in the House of Representatives. I will also be pushing to make sure water infrastructure is part of that. And so in my subcommittee that I chair, Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, we'll be hearing about my very comprehensive water infrastructure bill. I'm hoping that sometime in the weeks ahead, I'll be able to dovetail that with the other infrastructure efforts. And you are going to see in the next 30 days or so in the House of Representatives more action and more progress on answering our unmet infrastructure needs than we've seen in a decade. So stay tuned and look for some good outcomes in that regard. I think that's where I'll stop in terms of my update portion of this office hours. I want to get to the dialogue because I have a phenomenal guest. Everybody's talking about, will there be in-person school this year? Will we have a 5-day school week that has kids on site, on campus? And here in Marin County, there was a bit of a bombshell yesterday when our local school authorities, in conjunction with our public health director announced that they are going to on-site 5-day-a-week school starting this fall. And we have got the superintendent of public instruction from Marin County, Mary Jane Burke, to join us to tell us all about that. Mary Jane can certainly answer any of your questions about Marin County, but she's also very close to her colleagues in other counties and to the statewide associations that are working throughout California. So she's a really good person to talk to, not just about Marin, but about where we're going in terms of trying to reopen safely our public schools, which is a critical part of reopening the economy and making any of this work, but we got to get it right. And she's on the hot seat, but we're delighted to have her. Mary Jane, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about what's going on and how we're going to safely return kids to school this fall.
Sure. So let me start with, first of all, it wasn't a bombshell to the educators who we've been working with over a long period of time. And I think the way to frame it in Marin County is that we have been working to figure out how to reopen schools since March 16th. And I know that sounds a little dramatic, but that's actually what's happened. And so to provide a little context, essentially March 16th was the day that our state went from 3% of the students approximately being homeschooled to 100%, right? So that happened overnight. And one of the things that our community did right off was figure out quickly that we needed to have childcare available for our first responders, hospital workers, etc. So our public health officer, Dr. Willis, was on the leading edge of how could you provide service to kids in a safe way through a cohort model. And so we opened up actually our first pop-up childcare centers on March 19th. So just a few days later. I have to say we had a little practice during the air quality school closures year prior, and we had provided some childcare. So we felt like we had a little bit of practice, but so we opened up the childcare cohorts. They operated for about 10 weeks. It was totally in collaboration with all of our partners, the county, the local resource referral, the YMCA. I mean, everybody was sort of in play. And I guess it all speaks to the critical nature of relationships, frankly. If you don't have them, then it's very difficult when you need them in real time to start developing them. And that's true of all those partners, and in addition with our public health officer. So we had practice there, and we were able to serve, it was over 5,000 days of students. And during that time, we really practiced all that we knew was critical in terms of what does the PPE look like? How do you sanitize? How do you check kids in? Do you take temperatures? What do you do if there's a COVID positive student? What do you do if there's a COVID positive staffer? And all of that we worked out. And then in May, we actually opened some actual school programs as pilots. And there were, I think, 5 of those cohorts in Marin's Community School, which serves kids who need more opportunities for direct engagement, as well as several special education classes, 1 middle school, preschool. And we then took what we learned from the pop-up and applied it to the school-age students in schools throughout the county. So having gone through those steps, it's been an iterative process for sure, but we've been working along the way with Dr. Willis on behalf of our public schools, but also private independent parochial schools. Dr. Willis and Dr. Santora have been available, I would say, every day. Probably during this process, we've had some communication, but official meetings with the superintendents in the county and with our private independent school partners. So we knew, though, that we had a goal, right? And it was very quickly, very obvious early on that distance learning, while we have done an amazing job, educators have been over the top, working so hard, parents as well, but it's actually not working. And so knowing that, we knew we really have to figure this out of how to get kids back to school. So after a lot of work, a lot of steps along the way, Dr. Willis essentially looked at sort of our direction and said, okay, we can do this. So there's been some changes for sure. School will look different. It will not look the same. I, as the county superintendent, don't get to tell our school districts what school's going to look like for sure. And I have to say in my lane, so reminder, local control, but the guidelines that have been provided essentially provide the parameters or the guardrails, if you will, that provide opportunity for a school district to choose to bring kids back 5 days a week. And the main issue is that the cohort numbers are now what would be a typical class size. So if your typical class size at the kindergarten level at first is 20 to 25, you are able to bring in a cohort of 25, but there are many protocols that need to be followed. So we're excited. We're really excited. The right place for kids is in school, and we're very excited. But now the steps that the districts will be going through with their community partners, labor, just talking through each of the steps. The other thing, just so you know, that had been a big concern had to do with whether we would actually have the appropriate EPE or PPE for our staffs and students. And I want you to know that the answer is yes. Not only have we been ordering locally, but the state is scheduled next week to deliver all the PPE for, masks for children, not masks, excuse me, face coverings for children, for adults, hand sanitizer, face shields, all the stuff that we're going to need. So we know that that's been solved. And the other piece I think that we've looked at is that a stable cohort of 25 provides us opportunity to get all kids back in school, right, in a way that they're familiar with, even though these cohorts will not be mixing with any other cohort. So the class, when it goes to recess, will go to recess with themselves, not with other students. Same with lunch, etc. But we know we've practiced this, we know how to do it, and we're excited to be actually leading in the state on this issue.
Well, thank you for teeing it up, and I'm so impressed that you and other educators have been working this closely with Matt Willis and his public health team, because that's really the way it has to be. And I have great confidence, of course, in all of you. So that's a great thing. And I think you're making a really important point that even though you're the superintendent at the county, every school district may have their own protocols, right?
Right.
So,
well, but they will follow these guidelines, but within those guidelines, so it's a little, the way I think about it, imagine in the state, we have standards to teach and we have instructional minutes that we have to meet. But if you went to every single school, you would see a nuance or an iteration of that, right? So it won't look the same in every school for sure.
do you expect every school district in, let's just say in Marin, to actually go all the way to 5 days on site, or do you think you might see variation?
I think so. I think so. We after we reviewed the document with the superintendents on, I think it was Wednesday, I asked for a thumbs up, and I would say that they're definitely looking at it. I think the one thing that we just have to acknowledge is that there will be some families that choose not to send their children to school and that will want to wait until there is a vaccine. And as we know, that could be a year out, right, or longer. And so the districts are, going to be providing other options for the family who does not want to, access the program.
Okay, and that was one of the questions I suspect everybody who's tuning in right now has, is what if a kid or their family just doesn't feel safe?
Right.
You will accommodate, you will find ways to accommodate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that will be, very important. And that, that it comes down to it that, and parents, we have done surveys through the county, and in the special ed area, 92% want their kids back in school, just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
And so we are operating a full summer school program. As of Monday, we started this week, and we have we have a few models. Most of the classes are in person, all the kids are there. A couple of the classes have students who are in class, and then students who are attending the full day class via live Zoom. So that's another option. And then we have some students who parents are not quite ready, or the students are medically fragile and need to stay on a virtual platform. So we've got all of that going on. And so I think that will be a part of what we'll see evolving in our school districts. But the key is they can have all the kids in school 5 days a week.
Yeah. What about teachers and other education staffers who may still be nervous about showing up with this many people?
So we learned a lot in this space as well, in that when things sort of closed down so quickly, under the shelter in place, right? And the thinking that, you know, you're supposed to shelter in place. One of the pluses, I guess, for education is that we are also included in the essential worker category. So there have been some people working all along. And as we have reopened, for example, the County Office of Education or other offices or classrooms, we have been very, very careful to listen to each and every concern and determine how it is that we're going to figure that out so people are comfortable. The bottom line is, if the adults aren't comfortable, right, then the kids aren't going to be comfortable. So it's really important. So I think the strategy of this isn't if we're coming back, right? So we know that we're clear. It's good for kids. We're coming back. What are the conditions we need to make sure that are in place that will be able to make sure that you feel comfortable? So we've been working on that. And the big ones have been the PPE for sure. What will it look like? What will the cleaning, disinfecting be? And then also there was a lot of concern about childcare, but that was really keying off of if it was less than a 5-day program, right? Like what about my kids and childcare if we were on a 2-day program? So, but I think we really, your comment about people are anxious, particularly when they haven't been in play for a while. And so I think all of this piloting work has helped a lot. So we have our own educators, whether they're paraprofessionals or teachers, able to talk about the steps that we've taken. And if anyone is interested, if they go to the county office website, we have a Rethinking Schools section, and we have really documented along the way everything we've done. So how do we open the office, right? How did we, we striped off the entire organization so people knew what 6 feet looked like, make sure everyone has the sanitizers they need. Everyone's wearing face coverings, except for if you happen to be in an office. And so we put in all the protocols, redid the staff rooms, etc. And so we've documented all of that, how we did it, what we did, and then we've recorded it. And we've done that in about 8 different areas, including issues like, how do you clean? What does it look like, right? What's the QR code you use so you're keeping track of people's health as they enter the buildings? And because part of this issue isn't whether or not COVID cases will exist, right? And this is all about risk. It is actually that they will exist, and we know exactly what to do. In fact, we have a infographic that describes exactly what will happen when there is a COVID positive. And if anyone's interested, next Tuesday, Lisa Santora will be reviewing that and doing a training on that. So it's all about, but you have to take your time. We came in phases. So the thing that's so great about where we are is that we were very specific with Dr. Willis and Lisa Santora, asking for the time frame of about June 15th to June 18th, so that we would still have time in this current fiscal year to be able to be getting ready for the fall. So we're so appreciative that they prioritize this. The one thing we have not figured out yet, and there'll be a separate task force working on it, is transportation. And that continues to be a big one, because many of our students are transported on buses that have many, many students on them. And so we still have work to do, but we're working with the Transportation Authority of Marin and all of the providers and vendors. So we still have a lot of work to do, actually.
Well, that's great. I know that we've got a bunch of questions that are already starting to flood in, so I should get to those as quickly as possible. But before I ask Jenny to read our first question, let me just ask, to contextualize this moment, you've got massive cuts being contemplated in Sacramento.
Right.
I'm having a hard time persuading my colleagues across the aisle back in Washington to support state and local governments so that we can keep the lights on for schools.
Right.
You're describing a Herculean effort to get our schools open again, make them safe. That's going to involve changes to, I'm sure, the facilities, certainly all sorts of new demands to keep these cohorts separate from each other, to do extra cleaning, to do all of these things and have these PPE devices just dispersed. And how do you do that if we're in the middle of massive layoffs and cuts?
Well, it's unbelievably challenging. And this is obviously throughout the state. And so what we're trying to do right now is just keep our eye on the ball, right? Which is the students, and trying to figure out all the strategies that we need. And we're counting on those that are in these decision-making roles to have a clear understanding that it costs money. And for, as you know, it's $18 billion cut in education for the state of California. And so we're getting some information. While we don't have a budget yet, it does look like we're going to see a little bit of leeway, but frankly, what we're seeing is that the big cuts will come next year, right? But I do think that those that believe in investing in communities need to first and foremost invest in kids and the people that support them, our teachers and classified staff. So we're working hard at that angle too.
We got to help you from the federal side of this, because
I
know the
we are so counting on that, Jared. I mean, that is everything you read. If the federal government does provide this is what we won't have to do. And there's districts in our county that have cut hundreds of employees. I've cut multiple employees at the county office. So we're in a situation where it's dire, actually. So anything you can do and any support we can give you, I'll be there.
You can count on it. All right, let's go to our questions. Go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, so a lot of these questions and comments are, first of all, in support of school opening, and I'm going to combine some of them because we don't have a lot of time. A number of people are asking about what will this look like for secondary school, where kids are taking different levels of the same course, or have cohorts for sports practice, and are there guidelines that are recommending a cohort size for secondary education?
That's a great question. How rigid is this 25 cohort?
So they're actually the structure that we have has no numbers at all. So the 25 was an example. So essentially, the cohort size is whatever your class size would be. And so just for you to know, so it could be ranging, right, in the elementary from back to 20 to 28. So people have some leeway there. The key, though, is establishing an actual cohort, meaning that who those kids are and who they interacted with throughout a school day. And the purpose of that is so that when there's a COVID positive, you are not in a position of closing down a school, but rather the cohort. And originally, it would have been
right from that cohort.
Exactly. So at the high school level, there is more flexibility, just for you to know, than the single cohort. There is the availability of actually having larger cohorts. And in our community, about the largest class size, and this is all schools, is about 36 you would see at high school. And I'm not counting like PE, right? So that's your largest class size. And there is allowance for multiple cohorts to actually mix, right? So essentially, there will be more leeway. So it'll be interesting to see how the districts look at that. The other thing that's been permitted is that originally, when we first started, it was a stable cohort and stable staff, right? You couldn't mix staff. That is now changed based on all the science and the information that we have, and common sense. You have a single teacher, the teacher gets sick, you need a sub. You can't say, oh, how, so that's part of the issue. But now teachers are able to move between cohorts. So I think the way it's going to look is that there's a group of students that we're operating in a cohort, and they can mix with at least another two cohorts ultimately. So that's why they can track that larger group. And the expert teachers would be able to move between these cohorts. So it will definitely be different than we've seen. And also, given that we know that in the event of a COVID positive in a classroom, that the cohort class would need to shut down, right, for 14 days from the date of exposure. And that doesn't mean they will no longer be learning. It means that they will need to be able to be nimble enough to move into a distance learning approach, right? So we'll still have some virtual to be able to maintain the educational continuity, and you'll probably see live Zoom opportunities as well. So, and in terms of sports, the decision, at least on the immediate, had to do with the public health directive about summer camps. And that was students could have a summer camp, but they would have to be in a 12 cohort, and they would have to be 3 weeks. And so right now what the coaches are doing is following that protocol. So Dr. Willis just took that protocol, applied it to sports. So that's where we are right now. We're going to get more information soon about sports, because the CIF is going to be making a determination about next year's schedule, I think on July 20. But this is exactly so. All the extra stuff, and when I say that, I don't mean that it's extra. I get it that there are kids that go to school and it has nothing to do with academics. They're there to do their art class, be involved in mock trial, do sports, right? And
you just described most of my early years.
Yeah, exactly. But it's true, right? Yeah, exactly. Picture volleyball. But exactly. The thing is, so and that's true for most kids, right? I mean, when you talk to kids right now, and one of the main reasons this has not worked, people, they want to be with their friends, they want to be with their teachers, all of these things that are all part of school. So these things will all be addressed as the same way that transportation.
But you don't necessarily have definitive answers to every part of
no, and definitely not in this space. And it's just going to be because on the automatic, it's like there's not going to be choir. Why? Because that's when we see more issues, right? But then you say, well, what if we're on a football field and everybody's divided? Then could we, so we're always like trying to figure out how do we meet the public health requirements. And I guess I just want to say, just a reminder, this is all about risk, right? The only way that we can be sure is you can stay home until there's a cure or whatever. And the analogy I've been using is the analogy of driving. We know there's a risk to driving, right? But we've decided as a society it's important that we get around and we use cars. And so we have these lanes that we follow. We wear a seatbelt. We know that we stop at a stop sign and we follow speed limit rules. And now we have airbags and we put kids in car seats. But there's still a risk, and people do actually get injured in a car. So I think if we can just keep our heads around, it's about that we think public education is really important and that kids need to come to school, right? And yes, there are risks, and there'll be some people who are unable, and I'm not even say unwilling, they're unable to accept that risk at this point. And for those people, we'll make sure that they're well taken care of and their children are well taken care of.
All right, let's go to the next question.
Okay, I have a quick question for Mary Jane and then one for you, Jared. Okay. So Mary Jane, what is your jurisdiction over private schools and who's helping?
None. Absolutely none, zero, zip. However, I have been in my career, so for over 20 years, every 3 months or so, I hold meetings with the heads of private, public, independent schools. And the reason is because when it comes to some of the basics, it's all the same. They're all our kids, right? And many families have kids in public school and private independent parochial. And so that's been part of our culture, which then makes, especially on emergency preparedness and what are we going to do about the flood, and we need to be in better communication. So we have had strong communication. And so in this case, it's easy then. So they too, by the way, have a weekly call with me each week over this period, and we're just keeping them up to date. And then when I talk about these guidelines, I also got a subgroup of that group. So that, Travis Brownlee from Marin Academy, Chris Mazzola from Branson, Chris Valdez from Marin Catholic, Joe Harvey.
Dr. Willis has been working with you. Presumably he's working with the private schools as well. And we will see pretty similar protocols and practices. Is that fair to say?
These actually apply to all the private schools as well. So what came out is for all school jurisdictions, public, private, independent, parochial.
Okay, good. Next question.
Okay, so Congressman, this one's for you.
Okay.
So Joan is really concerned. Her question has to do with unemployment and the $600 extra people are receiving, which Congress passed until the end of July. I work at a school. What happens if they decide in August they don't need all of us classified staff and we get laid off? It's still due to the virus, yet we don't get the advantage of receiving the extra 600 like everyone else has for several months. Concerns about being laid off, classified staff, and these benefits expiring.
Right. So the question is about if you're laid off after this extended extra unemployment benefit expires. Well, a couple of things about that. First, we're trying to extend that. And I hope we're successful in the days ahead, because that was always too short a time frame to address the kind of economic dislocation from this crisis. So we would certainly work with you. We're really talking about that extra $600. I think normal unemployment benefits would still be available if somebody is laid off after this window closes, but it would be great if you were able to get that extra bump, and we'll do what we can. But I think that's the bottom line. We got to see what Congress does. We're having a robust debate about it right now. Some of my colleagues across the aisle think that $600 was overly generous, that it somehow created an incentive for people not to go back to work when those jobs reopened. Now, technically, if you were called back to work, you can't continue to get unemployment benefits. That's the way it works. You don't get to just collect when you've got a job waiting for you. So I think they're wrong on that front. And the point of that original $600 bump, which is a significant increase in unemployment benefits, was we wanted people to have an incentive not to go to work. We were asking everybody to stay home for a period of many weeks. And so that was one of the tools that we put on the table to encourage folks to not go out and seek work, to actually just help us solve this pandemic by keeping folks at home. What we're describing in reopening the schools and what you're seeing around the country in other ways is a new phase of this. And so I suspect that debate over the extra 600 is going to be a tough one. I don't know if we'll be able to fully reauthorize the full 600. We will try. It might be less than that. It might be just conventional unemployment. I don't know. But I'm pushing for at least some kind of augmented unemployment, and we'll have to see what happens.
Great. So this question's for Mary Jane, and it's from Larry. My child's learning suffered greatly during the distance teaching during the last 3 months of school, and she did not learn important concepts that she will need as a base going forward. Will teachers review and reteach, if necessary, material from March 16 through the end of the school year?
Right. Yes. I think everyone's just so well aware that is a challenge. That is the issue, right? And so that all great teachers are always attending to where a kid is and where we want them to go. And I think we will see additional opportunities for that kind of assessment as we build forward. So it will be very individualized and very, very important, right? So yes, I think you can count on that, and that would be throughout all our schools.
Mary Jane, I'm going to sneak another question in. It sounds to me from what you've described like this is going to be a pretty adaptive process, that you're going to have to see how certain things go. There are going to be externalities that could change the equation within the public school system. If we have outbreaks that crash the healthcare system, if we have any number of things outside of your control, how are you going to approach the need to be nimble and to adapt and maybe, turn the dial back a little bit as you try to return us to normal?
Right, right. So I think we, even though I'm going to be the first to say it didn't work, right? In other words, distance learning, there's a reason why we go to school in person, right? So we'll just go with that. But I think we showed our community that no matter what, we tried, right? And we tried hard and we learned a lot. And we've added new training modules for our educators in collaboration with Dominican and others. So we definitely have sort of ramped up on the training. In fact, this summer, our hope is that all of our teachers and classified staff all get Google certified. So they're ready, ready to go. So we feel really, very good about that. I think we are not, the one thing I'm not worried about, just for you to know, and this is based on Dr. Willis, he does not see a scenario at all where schools just close down again. Okay. So that's not sort of the way he's seeing this. He does see cohorts, but not that the whole school system will go down. So I feel
very
like
localized, targeted.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to be, I think, we're going to be ready. And we're talking about some of these approaches that we might be able to address on a countywide basis. But what we know is that we need to make sure that students are able to continue, right? Because the other piece, continue their learning. The other piece is that because a cohort is not in school, doesn't mean they're sick. Right? I mean, it doesn't mean they're sick. And as we well know, in our county now, we're at 22,000 people tested. And with that number, we're under 4%, right, of the people that are testing positive. So, and that number used to be closer to, 6.5% at the early start of this. So we're getting more asymptomatic people, right, who we are testing positive. That's the other thing. We're going to see more testing as part of the overall protocol of the adults, for sure.
Of the adults. Terrific. Well, I think we're out of time, but I really want to thank you, Mary Jane, for joining us. All of my constituents in Marin County are blessed to have such a fantastic superintendent, and you've just been a great ally and friend for many, many years for me personally. And
thanks, Jared. Back at you. Not everybody thinks I'm that great right now. Remember, there's people that don't want school to open.
You got a tough job. You got a tough job.
We're lucky. You know what? We're both lucky to be leading in this particular time, right?
Yeah,
great opportunity.
It's a little, a public health officer is probably the hardest job in the world right now.
Absolutely.
But in the weeks ahead, being on a school board, being a superintendent, being an educator is going to be a really tough one. So we're rooting for you. I want it to go really well, and thanks for sharing your time with us.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Bye. Bye, Jenny. Thank you.